Unless you've been the direct recipient of this man's kindness and generosity, you've probably not heard of him. He's never done a TV interview. He's almost always working in the shadows. In fact, he's not even a local guy. He traveled 800 miles from his lifelong home in Atlanta, Georgia, to be here with us. And that's rather special. But this man has been an eyewitness to history, feet away from historic events. He's a dear friend of mine, and I've asked him to share his story because you and I need to learn from it. And knowing it could change how we think about life, death, and forgiveness. This may be one of the most important episodes of State of Independence. Hope you'll stay with us. His name is Phil Finch, and he was born and raised in Georgia a decade or so before major changes in America's civil rights laws. He was raised under the leadership of a man who was the father of the 20th century's most famous orator, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., the man who baptized him. He was an usher and later became the head deacon at Ebenezer Baptist Church, the spiritual home for the civil rights movement, where both Reverend King Sr. and Jr. preached. He was at the funeral in April 1968 when over 100,000 observers came to see the body of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. brought to the stately red brick sanctuary on a simple horse-drawn carriage. And he was there when a crazed gunman came to assassinate Dr. King Sr. but killed his wife instead during a Sunday morning service in 1974. So what has he learned about God's grace, forgiveness, and the simple act of trusting and obeying God? Phil, it's a joy to welcome you to State of Independence, my friend. It's so good to have you here.
Glad to be with you, Joe.
Yeah, we started a long time ago together, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Yeah, we were babies, I'd like to say.
Yes.
Yeah, in the fall of, 1971?
That's right.
Yeah, when we started college together at the University of Pennsylvania, and then we ended up, of course, being in Bible study together. I became a Christian while I was at Penn, and I think you were already a believer when you got to Penn.
Yes, I was on the fringes, but it brought me closer to the Lord.
It didn't show, brother. It didn't show. It didn't show. Yeah, you were always somebody that I admire, in Bible study. I just said, man, what a powerful witness. And the thing that gets me is so we're students together and we're in Bible study every week, studying the scriptures. And I knew you from Atlanta. You and Willie Griffin,
That's
roomed
right.
together. And there are a bunch of our friends who are from Atlanta. But I knew you from Atlanta. But this is how kids are in college. You're it never even occurred to me that you were an usher at Ebenezer. Just like you became head deacon. It never occurred to me that you were there. You were right there with Dr. King. I never once, in all the time we had together, asked you about Dr. King Jr. or Dr. King Sr. And why, I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking. But I never once, but here it is, my friend was a witness to history, but more importantly, you knew them as people.
Yes, well, that was my life at the time. So there was nothing really unique or special about it to me. It was just like that was my average everyday life. So I didn't feel like there was something special about it.
Right.
I didn't feel it was something that I needed to share with the world or anything like that. It was just common, everyday. I was a kid growing up in Atlanta, went to church every Sunday like most other kids did. They went to their church, I went to my church. There was nothing special about it,
So at your church, Daddy King, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. was the pastor, and then was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. like the co-pastor, or?
Those were the titles that they actually both had the title of co-pastor. Reverend King Sr. called himself co-pastor.
Really?
But we all knew that the pecking order was Dr. King Sr. was the pastor, senior pastor, and Reverend King Jr. was the co-pastor.
Yeah.
That's the way it was. And at that time, back in the 60s, early 60s, from 60 to 68, for Dr. King Jr., it was a blessing to be able to be in a setting like that, because it allowed him to do parish ministry, if you will, but at the same time gave him the freedom that was needed to be the leader of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. And so what was he like? I mean, outside of there's the historical figure who gave the great speeches, the I Have a Dream speech in Washington in 1963, and all these other great speeches, in 1965, 64, these, the marches into Alabama, so memorable in other places. So what was he like to you? Did you ever interface with him? I mean,
well, my personal interaction with him was somewhat limited.
Yeah.
But at the same time, everybody needs a place where they can just call home and be themselves, where they can be, quote, regular,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think Ebenezer provided a place for Dr. King Jr. to be regular. So there were occasions when he performed a wedding ceremony, if you will. In fact, he married my cousin, my favorite female cousin. He was the officiant at her wedding. That's Dolores and Henry Harper now, but he was the officiant at their wedding, and he enjoyed taking the time to be with kids and to interact with other adults. He established in our church what we call the month clubs in our church. This was a way for the church to have kind of small churches inside the church.
Nice.
So people born in the same month would be able to be a part of the club together. And like one Sunday a month, they would all get together and have dinner at somebody's house and just socialize with each other and plan their outreach ministries together and so forth. But it was a way to break the church down so that smaller groups could be effective in the life of the church. And that was his brainchild. And month clubs still exist today in Ebenezer.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
So he wanted to be a regular person there, and that's the way we treated him.
Yeah.
Many of the older people in church called him ML. That was his name to them because they knew him from a child.
Right.
And back in those days, it was often that black preachers went by initials anyway.
Right.
So he was ML, his brother was AD.
Right.
And that's the way they were referred to primarily by the older people in the church. Now, younger people called him Dr. King and so forth, but the older one, ML, AD, that was the way.
And Coretta Scott King, I mean, I guess you saw her?
No, I saw more of her than I did of him, of course, because she was there nearly every Sunday, but he would be there on, a couple of Sundays a month to preach and so forth. And then after his passing, of course, she became much more prominent and much more involved and engaged in the whole civil rights movement. But she was also a part of the church. Yeah. And the church, she was a very common person too. Church was church for her. Yeah. So it was common to see her walking in the church, greeting people, hugging people, and it was common for people who knew coming to the church to come and greet her. Same is true for for Dr. King's sister.
Yes. Christine
King Ferris. Yeah. The same way. And even today, in her 90s, when she comes to church, she stays around church for people to come and speak to her, and if they want to take a picture with her. And so she is very open and very giving, very loving, that kind of person. And that's really that whole family, has been in our setting. It was always a loving experience with all of them.
That's so beautiful.
Yes.
I guess it was all started by ML Sr. I guess he was the one that kind of set the tone. You knew him well, and he baptized you?
He baptized me, yes. I was 7 years old and was baptized by him. It's an interesting story about that, too, because on the night, baptisms were done in the evening during that time, and on the night that I was baptized, my godfather was there with me. And my godfather was a very light-skinned and I don't even know if I should call him African American. He was a very light-skinned guy, And Dr. King Sr., after the baptism, and we all came back into the sanctuary, he said to me, "Boy, who was that with you?" I said, and you know how he was speaking. Right. "Boy, who was that with you?" Right. And I said, and I used the term "play daddy." Yeah. Because that's kind of the way I referred to him. But he was my godfather. He and his wife were godfather and godmother. And I actually ended up living with them for most of my life from age 3 up until till they passed. I was 19 years old, I think, when my godfather passed, and I was 21 or 22 when my godmother passed. So we lived with them. I lived with them during that time. So he was a very light-skinned guy, and Dr. King wanted to know who he was. He had never seen him at the church before, and it would have been a shock to him to see a white guy being the godparent of this young man has been in my church and has been in this church all his life, and I'd never seen him before.
Yeah, he was a pretty direct guy. I mean,
yeah, he was very direct. There was, I remember a Sunday when he was talking to a couple of teachers, educators in the church, and it was during a fundraising time, and he pointed to them and called them out by name and expected them to make a financial contribution in the church. And he told them right in church in front of everybody and called their names. So yeah, he was very direct, very direct.
Yeah, he was an amazing person. I got to know him and interface with him a few times, and I was already out of seminary when I met him, but my first job was at Talladega College in Alabama, one of the great historically black colleges in the country. And I was the chaplain there, and I just was in my first year, and I thought to myself, you know what, I'm in Alabama, and wouldn't it be great if Martin Luther King Sr. could be our Martin Luther King Jr. Day speaker in January of 1979, and so nobody stopped me, and I just got in my little car and drove from Alabama to Atlanta, and we didn't have GPS back then, so I just had to ask around, and I asked people where Ebenezer was. They told me, and I got to Ebenezer, and I walked inside the church. I don't know if you can probably do that anymore, but this is in the late 70s. You could just walk in the church, and I just walked in, unannounced, and made my way to what looked like the pastor's office, and two women that were working there asked me who I was. And I said, I'm Joe Watkins, I'm Reverend Joe Watkins. He said, okay. And he says, why are you here? I said, well, I'm here to see Dr. King. He said, is he expecting you? I said, well, no. He said, does he know you? I said, well, no. And she said, well, you can't see Dr. King. He doesn't see people he doesn't know just walking off the street like that. You can't see him. You got to make an appointment. You got to know. I said, oh, okay. And so he said, you have to leave, young man. So I said, okay. So I left, but just the office, not the building. I go into the hallway. I figure at some point he's got to go to the bathroom, because he's an older man. So I sat in the hallway and waited for him to walk past me, and sure enough, he did. And when he did, I got his attention, started talking to him, and he said, okay, young man, let me go to the bathroom, and then when I come back, we can talk. So he comes back, and he says, come with me. So he brings me to his office, and when the secretaries see me coming in with him, they were mad. They were like, what are you doing with this guy? We just told him to leave. He might be a nut. But he was so nice. He said, so boy, what do you want? I said, well, sir, if you could just come and preach at the college for Martin Luther King Day. He says, what college? I said, well, Talladega College. He said, oh, in Alabama? I said, yes, sir, yes, to Alabama. He says, what'd you do there? I said, well, I'm the chaplain there. And he said, okay, I'll come. So I said, really? He says, yeah, I'll come.
Surprised.
I was just shocked. I thought he was going to be like, well, let me think about it and then call me next week. But he says, yeah, I'll come. He says, yeah, so make the arrangements at my secretary's, but I'll come. I said, well, great. So he came and spoke, and it was just amazing. He preached, and
wonderful.
Yeah, it was just wonderful. I mean, we had a packed chapel that Sunday.
And I think you hit him at the right time because this was in a phase of his life when he felt the need to be able to share the gospel message beyond Ebenezer itself.
Yeah.
To get out himself to do it. He had traveled around plenty of times before, but he had this special earning during that time. Now, he had retired from the active pastorate at Ebenezer at that time. He was our pastor emeritus by that time. In 1975, Joe Roberts was called as our pastor.
Right.
So Joseph Roberts was pastor for 30 years at Ebenezer from 1975 until 2005. And for the latter part of Dr. King Sr.'s life, he was our pastor emeritus. And he was a pastor with high regard and high respect.
Yeah.
But there were many times, on many Sundays, where he would go out of Atlanta to go somewhere else to preach and spread the gospel. He never stopped doing that. Even though he had retired from active ministry at Ebenezer, he still took the gospel message wherever he could.
Now, you were there, and I never even talked to Dr. King about this, but you were there when many people don't know that his wife was killed in church.
Yes.
In 1974.
Yes.
That would have been the summer before our senior year at Penn. And again, like I wasn't even clued into any of this. I mean, I knew it happened, but you were there the day it happened?
Yes. So it was my custom Even though we were at Penn, anytime we got a break, like summer break and Christmas holidays breaks, I would come back home to Atlanta, and I picked up my routine, which was to go to Ebenezer and I'd worship, and on the Sundays that the men's chorus would sing, I sang, and on the Sundays that my usher board ushered, I would usher. So it just turned out that on this Sunday, the board that I served on for ushering was ushering that day. And this turned out to be a fifth Sunday, I believe, in June of 1974, when we were having worship service. And this was at a time when it was very solemn in church. Everybody's heads were bowed, eyes were closed, because it was a moment in the service when you're playing the Lord's Prayer.
And who played that?
And Mrs. King. Mrs. King played the Lord's Prayer. She was sitting at the Hammond organ playing the Lord's Prayer, and which was on the floor at that time. We had a pipe organ, which was nearer the choir stand, but the Hammond organ was on the floor. She was playing the Hammond organ on that Sunday. And there are 3 pews that are right adjacent to that organ. So she's playing solemnly the Lord's Prayer. And then all of a sudden, everybody's heads are down, eyes closed. We heard gunshots ring out. And it turned out that this was a young man who had come to church earlier on the day, gone to Sunday school, and came to worship service on it. Just seemed like a regular person, but he was carrying a briefcase. And at the time that we sang the Lord's Prayer, he stood up on the pew that he was sitting at, which was adjacent to the organ, and he shot Mrs. King. He shot a deacon who was at the door nearest that pew. And there was another member of the church who was shot, but she did not die from her wounds. But Deacon Boykin and Mrs. King were both killed in that incident. And that was, I tell you, you talk about solemn occasions. That was probably the most solemn, most devastating experience that we had as a church, to experience that in the life of the church. And of course, he was apprehended. At the time he was apprehended, he was trying to reload his gun as if he was coming back in. And later on, when he was, interrogated and so forth, people were trying to understand why. And his intent was to come to church. He said he had been told by God to come to church and kill Martin Luther King Sr. But it turns out on that Sunday, Reverend King Sr. was not sitting he was at church, but he was not sitting in the pulpit. We had a guest minister that was preaching on that day. And so I don't know if that just threw him off or what. This was Marcus Wayne Chenault who did the shooting. And he shot Mrs. King. And I tell you, she was the sweetest person that you ever want to know. I mean, really, honestly. She is the person who was like a pastor in the church because she had the heart of a pastor. When somebody new joined the church, she would talk with them, find out what kind of things they did professionally or what their interests were, and try to line them up with a ministry in the church. One of my closest friends, the Terrys, Cynthia Terry, would often say that Mrs. King met her, found out she was in music, and said, "Okay, you need to be in charge of the of the children." And so she wanted to have her teach music and children, lead a choir in the church with the children. So that's something that she would always do, and not just for her, but I mean for anybody new who joined the church. She was the one who would try to guide them.
Daddy King, I know, was devastated that his wife, the love of his life, would be killed, especially in church. Was he able to forgive Marcus Wayne Chenault, who killed his wife?
Joe, and this is one of those things that, as a Christian, it just blows your mind when you think of this. Dr. King would never hate anybody. Even this person who killed his wife, he could not hate them. And instead, he forgave him, and that, what can you say?
What can you say? Yeah.
As a Christian, and particularly thinking about it in a time like this today, when there's so much, division, so much, name calling, so much, separating, dividing, as opposed to trying to find common denominators that could bring us together. Excuse me.
No, it's all right, brother.
So when you hear a person like John Lewis say, that I'm too busy to hate, that hate is too heavy a burden to bear, that didn't originate with John Lewis. Martin Luther King Sr. exhibited that throughout his life. And that's the message that he tried to teach everybody. He tried to teach all of us that, that even the person, the black person that is qualified to do this job and is not getting it because of the color of his skin, he would not allow that even to be a situation for hate, right? Yeah. But he would always encourage us to make sure you get out and vote. Yes. Make sure you own your own property, own your own home. He taught the basic principles of American life so that we could be in a position to advance and do as much as we possibly can. He encouraged us to get educated. Yes. You go to school, get your degree, so nobody can hold you back. Yes. Those are the kind of things that he taught.
Yeah, what a wonderful man, and what a wonderful example of Christ likeness. When I talked to him in Fort Wayne, Indiana, when I was chaplain there, he told me that I asked him how he felt about the people that killed his son. And his son was not an historical figure to him or a celebrity to him. That was his son, his flesh and blood, his boy. And he told me that he forgave those people. He said he forgave. He says, you just have to love people, he said, and forgive them, and you have to let it go. Yeah. Love them. And coming from him, it's just so powerful a word, but it's a message, as you said, to every one of us, to everybody listening, watching today, as to what it means to follow Christ. Certainly, Jesus forgave the people who crucified him, who were put him to death on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And here we have Martin Luther King Sr. forgiving the man who killed his wife, intentionally shot and killed his wife, and forgiving the people who killed his son and who persecuted his son while his son was here. Mm. And I know that his word was powerful because of you, because it's obviously that same sweet spirit of Christ is in you, brother, and has always been in you since I've known you. And it's just a blessing. Everybody you know that touches you, I think is changed by you, because they see Jesus in you. A lot of people never get to see Christ, but they get to see the Christ in us. And because of you and your life and your witness, a lot of people have seen Christ in you. And I know they've been changed because of you.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, Joe. This is one little funny thing. It's really not funny, I guess, but in a Bible study class once that was led by somebody else that I happened to be sitting in on, the person had us memorize this verse. And it said, you are writing a gospel, a chapter a day, by the deeds that you do and the words that you say. People read what you write, distorted or true. What is the gospel according to you? And that's what I'm trying to live by.
Amen, brother. Amen. God bless you, brother. God bless you.
Bless you back.
Yeah. We'll be right back.
You're watching Joe Watkins' State of Independence on Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Share your comments about today's program in the comment box at joewatkins.org.
It's been a special honor to have Phil Finch back in Philadelphia and here in our studio. He's lived a life of love and sacrifice for others. We're thankful he could share memories that few have heard before, and we're richer for it. Let's talk to our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
Boy, so many thoughts. When Phil was talking at the end, I was thinking about the day, and you remember this day, that the gunman came into the Amish school in Lancaster County. Yeah. And immediately, almost within that same news period, the Amish community rushes in. They're burying their children, and at the same time, they're embracing the gunman. And to a watching world, maybe the thought is these people are just naive. They're weak. Why didn't they fight back? If they had, the opportunity to do this. And there are so many examples of this, all the kind of the kindness and the meekness and the mildness of Christians. And you're looking at this scene play out, and you go, well, I wish somebody would have just handed him a gun.
Yeah.
Or couldn't they have fought back? And instead, the example that you get out of these moments is everything about what it means to be a follower of Christ, being willing to give your life up for someone else.
Yeah.
And then in the end, learning from his example. You mentioned it, the thief on the cross. This great scene in all of history when he is forgiving. And how does that happen? How does that work?
Yeah, well, meekness is not weakness. It takes tremendous strength
Right.
and love to not hit back and to love somebody who's done you wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what's so powerful about what Phil Finch said about Dr. King. To forgive. It's one thing if somebody steals a candy bar from you, you say, "Oh, I forgive you," because you can get another one, but you can't get the life back of your wife or your son.
Yeah. And this is a tragedy that is playing out in cities all over the country, with pandemics and stress, opioid abuse, suicides up. I was talking to someone the other day getting kind of the status report from one of the cities in Pennsylvania, and he says he has never seen murders and despair this high in his entire life. And this is something that's been replicated in city after city. And think, what's happening? Well, we're unplugged now from kind of the spiritual source of our strength, and we're having to figure this out alone.
Yeah.
And that isn't a good place for us to be if we're trying to figure, well, how do we do this without God? How do we do life without a purpose? How do you experience pain and grief that's been caused by someone else and not embrace forgiveness and instead go in the other direction? We're at a crossroads, I think, in the culture where we have to decide which way we go. And Christ offers a pathway. And you don't have to be a Christian or a religious person at all to get the benefits from forgiveness. We know that's good for the soul. Yeah. But, of course, we hope that people find that in a relationship with Christ.
Yeah. So well said, Jeff. So well said. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with my longtime friend and brother, Phil Finch. If it meant something to you, please send me a comment in the comment box at joewatkins.org. It means a lot to me and our team at State of Independence. I'll read and respond to each one of you. Today's conversation with Phil was designed to encourage you to trust God wherever you are and whatever your circumstances. We exist to equip you to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as you love yourself. If you're fighting to find the will to forgive, you can't do it alone. Only God's power can break through our hard hearts. Let Him do that for you. From America's first capital, Philadelphia, I'm Joe Watkins. God willing, I'll see you next week. What an amazing testimony.
Yeah.
What an amazing life. The power to forgive people.
Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.